Ladies and gentlemen, man preaching nothing once again with you, Nothing Studios. Pleasure. Something I've looked once again forward to for a very long time. And today I'm here to talk about something that's on everybody's mind, anybody who's in their 20s or even 30s. And that's 90s nostalgia. I'm absolutely done with it. It's run its course. Now here's the thing. Everybody likes to be nostalgic for whatever decade was 2 decades prior. In the 70s, they loved the 50s. Shows like Happy Days, etc. They wanted the greaser stuff to come back, etc. We all know the deal. In the 80s, there was a lot of 60s nostalgia. Now for a long time, I went back and forth on that. I said, maybe there was still 50s nostalgia in the 80s, because you have guys like Billy Idol wearing the leather jackets, free market economics, Reaganomics, conservative America. But there was a lot of 60s nostalgia too. You have like the Wonder Years and, just things like that. And as different as the 80s were from the 60s, there was definitely still nostalgia, especially I think in the 80s underground, punk rock scene and all that. I think you could probably date some of the counterculture overall concepts to the 60s. 90s, though, being nostalgic for the 70s, that goes without saying. Bell Bottoms came back in 98, this and that, the music, everything. That was without a doubt a decade of nostalgia because the 70s were so quirky and eccentric with bright colors. Then in the 2000s, we all know there was a lot of 80s nostalgia. Shows like Everybody Hates Chris, Napoleon Dynamite, all this stuff set in the 80s, NES, nostalgia for the first Nintendo, for a TV like from this era right here, 1983. We all know that. And now, 2014, we're in the mid-10s, and everybody my age and a little older wants the 90s back. They want the grunge, they want the flannel, they want the video games, they want the culture. It's absolutely everywhere. Nickelodeon has its own, I believe they pretty much turned Teen Nick into a 90s channel at night. I'll always love the 90s cartoons. I'll always love the 90s wrestling. But, some of the, some of the stuff was less than desirable from that time period. It wasn't a perfect time, and right now is a lot different because we're in a horrible economy. We're in the worst economy since the 30s, and in the 90s we had a great economy. A lot of people say, and probably rightly so, that it was kind of a bubble, the housing loans, etc., and it all collapsed at the end of the 2000s. But, it was a lot different, and at the same time, a lot of what people, it was both too different and both too similar. Because the 70s, for example, were a lot different from the 90s. That, bright colors, wacky, wild stuff, and so people kind of tried to bring it back, but on paper, that's a decade that makes sense to be nostalgic for because it was so eccentric. The 90s, though, I guess this plaid might descend from flannel. I don't know much about fashion, but flannel isn't that eccentric looking. It's not that wild looking, I don't know how you can be nostalgic for things that just weren't, like if I'm a huge wrestling fan. You watch a WWF Raw from 97. It's much different now, but, it wasn't like, there weren't wacky colors and disco and all that. It was still, how can you be nostalgic for something that's not that radically different than the world you live in? So you got that, and, I'll always love certain aspects, but I think I've kind of, and I always like to be, and I think that there are people out there who like to kind of be ahead of the curve and nostalgic for whatever decade was just 1 decade ago. I was nostalgic for the 90s and the 2000s. I missed my childhood when I was a teenager. And now I'm nostalgic for the 2000s. I missed my teenagehood. That was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. So why can't we just do 1 decade, the 90s? I don't know. It's just hard to really jump on board with it. Maybe at the same time there's some sort of fear because it's so surreal. It's so strange, After the 90s were over, they were still very recent for a long time, and people weren't nostalgic for it, but now it's been 2 decades ago. So maybe it's, maybe other people who criticize it, or myself included, it's a little too surreal, or too strange, or gives you a weird feeling. But, I don't know. 2000s nostalgia, I think, is where we should go. There's a lot of good stuff in that decade. I liked it a lot. It is very recently over in some ways, but, 2004 is now a decade ago. So I think enough time has passed. We can look back on it and create memories, etc. Well, anyway, this is the man preaching nothing. Speak to you soon.